Hi there, everyone. This is John Allen, the editor of Crux. We are an independent online Catholic news source. You can find us on the web at cruxnow.com. That is cruxnow.com. I am also a proud fellow at the Word on Fire Institute of Bishop Robert Barron. You can find all their resources on the web at wordonfire.institute. That's Word on Fire, all one word, .institute. Welcome to another episode of the John Allen Show, brought to you by the good people at Word on Fire. You know, normally on this show, we would take 3 or 4 big Vatican, global church, U.S. church headlines from the last week and sort of unpack all of them separately. But the truth of it is, we're living in a very unique moment, and it really is only one story that matters. One story that matters here in Rome, where the Pope is. One story that matters in all of Italy, for that matter. One story that matters for the entire world. And that, of course, is the coronavirus pandemic. I am speaking to you amid what is week 3 of a nationwide lockdown here in Italy. It began on March 11th. By the time you see this, the death count in this country almost certainly will be above 12,000 people. That's close to the number of people who died in the fabled eruption of Vesuvius in 79 AD, burying the entire city of Pompeii. It is a calamity of unimaginable proportions, and of course it is spreading all around the world, including very much in the United States. So this week we're going to be taking a look at the way the pandemic is playing out in Catholic life. In 3 different senses. First, we will be taking a look at Pope Francis's pastoral response to the coronavirus, featuring this remarkable Urbi et Orbi blessing that he administered last Friday from an empty, deserted St. Peter's Square. It was a haunting, a harrowing image. Many people believe it is likely to be the iconic image of this crisis and perhaps the iconic image of his papacy. But that's not the only thing the Pope is up to these days, so we'll be looking at what Pope Francis is trying to do to respond to the pandemic. We'll be looking at the Church's broader response with a particular focus here in Italy, where the Church at all kinds of levels has been mobilized in an attempt to bring relief to people who are suffering, not only people who are infected with the virus or who are in quarantine self-isolation because they have been exposed to the virus, but of course the coronavirus is having a much broader negative impact than just the count of people infected, as staggeringly high as that is. In many sectors, it has brought the economy grinding to a halt. It has made the problem of poverty worse. It has made the problem of homelessness worse. It has made the problem of hunger worse. It has considerably coarsened conditions for migrants and refugees. And in all of those sectors, the Catholic Church is active in trying to do something about it. So we will take a look at what the Church is doing, with a particular emphasis on the Vatican official who is the Pope's right arm when it comes to the administration of charity. That is Polish Cardinal Konrad Krajewski, or as he's known around here, Don Corrado, and how he sort of embodies the spirit of these days. And then finally, we will also review something we talked about the last time we were together, but it certainly has not gone away, which is the burgeoning debate in Catholic circles about exactly how open, exactly how accessible the Church ought to be amid this crisis. There are many Catholics who believe that the Church, for all intents and purposes, in terms of its public functions, ought to be shut down right now. In other words, it ought to be making the same sacrifices as all other sectors of society in order to try to contain the spread of this virus. And if that means no public mass, if that means no funerals, if that means no individual confession, then that's what it means, because the Church has to do its part along with everyone else. Now, there are others who believe that the Church is at risk of abdicating its mission amid this crisis. who are appalled at the idea that let's take Italy as an example, that grocery stores, pharmacies, food delivery services, even tobacco shops, hardware stores in this country are defined as essential services and allowed to remain open. People can still come, but not churches. Churches are open for private prayer, but you can't go for mass, you can't go for a funeral, you can't go for all kinds of things. There have actually been police raids on groups of people trying to gather in churches these days, and some Catholics believe that putting up with all that, just sort of accepting it, is a mistake. In that at the back end of this crisis, when it's all over, if we have allowed the outside world to define us as inessential, then that may well be how we're seen. So we will unpack how that debate is playing out as well. So that's the menu for this special coronavirus edition of the John Allen Show. Stick around, and I'll deliver you the context.
Hey everybody, it's Jared Zimmer, the director of Bishop Robert Barron's Word on Fire Institute. I hope you're enjoying the John Allen Show, which is yet another production brought to you by the Word on Fire Institute. I wanted to take a few seconds just to invite you to become a member of the Institute, where we offer numerous different aspects that can help form you as an evangelist. Things like courses on theology and philosophy and psychology and sociology. You'll also receive a quarterly journal in the mail throughout the year. Another exclusive offer that we'll be having if you enjoy the John Allen Show is a live Q&A with John, where you can ask questions about the culture, the church, media, etc. So when you join, you also get free access to Word on Fire Digital, which houses all of Bishop Barron's feature films, topical studies, study materials, and the like. So visit wordonfire.institute and come help us proclaim Christ to the culture.
All right, so let's begin with Pope Francis and what Pope Francis is trying to do as a pastor to respond creatively to the situation created by the coronavirus. First of all, he has repeatedly called for priests to find creative ways to be with their people in the midst of this crisis, and he's trying to practice what he preaches. Probably the most prominent way he is doing that is by live streaming his daily mass every day from the Domus Santa Marta, that's the residence and kind of the hotel, if you like, on Vatican grounds where he lives. It's a structure that was built under John Paul II. And the idea was, to be honest with you, first of all, it would provide a place for visitors to the Vatican to stay, people coming for conferences or synods and so on. But it was also created to provide a place for cardinals to stay during a conclave, so they wouldn't have to sleep on cots anymore in the cold apostolic palace, where access to things like bathrooms is tremendously limited. And it has proven a great success. It is in constant use, and Pope Francis, who is kind of a people person, at the beginning of his papacy decided he would rather live there than in the apostolic palace by himself. So he has decided, now he's always celebrated a morning mass in the chapel of the Santa Marta, but it's never been live streamed before. But because he knows that a lot of people who otherwise might be trying to get to daily mass are not able to do so right now, he has made that morning mass available. It is broadcast every morning at 7 a.m. Rome time, which means that is roughly 1 o'clock in the morning on the East Coast in the United States. But if you can't catch it live, you can watch. It's archived on YouTube and on the Vatican News site. You can always catch it on replay. It has proven to be a spectacular success here in Italy. The most recent ratings indicate that the Pope is commanding about 1/4 of the national television audience at that hour of the morning. People who otherwise probably would be tuning in to morning news shows or to cooking shows, or, if sports were being played, they would be watching sports shows. But instead, they are tuning in to the morning mass. RAI, which is the state television network here, the Pope's Mass accounts just on their one channel, Rai Uno, which is Rai number 1, accounts for 13.5% of their entire audience during the course of the day. So it has generated a massive audience, and that is one way that people now have access to the Pope every day. He begins those masses every morning with a very brief prayer intention. He then delivers a kind of extemporaneous homily every day, and he is also taken to leading a prayer for spiritual communion, understanding that the vast majority of people who are participating in that Mass are not doing so in person, and therefore are not able to receive the Eucharist. The Pope has also engaged in gestures of charity through the course of this crisis. Last Friday, for example, he donated 30 ventilators to Italian hospitals. Now, obviously, given the number of people infected here, the number of people undergoing treatment, 30 ventilators by itself is not an especially dramatic gesture. But it's symbolic, it's indicative of the Pope's pastoral concern for the crisis. The Italian bishops here, following Francis's lead, have donated at least 10 million euro to relief efforts, both to fund special needs at healthcare facilities and also for broader charitable efforts to try to to soften the blow of the crisis for people. But undoubtedly, the most remarkable thing that Pope Francis has done so far amid this pandemic to demonstrate pastoral concern was his decision last Friday evening to lead a special prayer service in St. Peter's Square, which included offering an Urbi et Orbi blessing, that's to the city, meaning Rome, to the city and to the world. Now, the Urbi et Orbi blessing is typically something that is delivered by popes only on Christmas, on Easter, and immediately after their election to the papacy. That's it. It is virtually unprecedented that a pope would decide to deliver an Urbi et Orbi blessing outside those settings. The Pope, for the occasion, also asked that two keenly venerated images here in Rome be brought to St. Peter's Square so that he could pray in front of them. One was the image of Maria Salus Populi Romani, Mary, Health of the Roman People. It's a historic painting of the Virgin Mary that is preserved in the Basilica of Santa Maria Maggiore in the Borghese Chapel here in Rome. The other is a historic crucifix, believed to be a miraculous crucifix, preserved in the Roman Church of San Marcello. Both are believed in earlier eras to have protected the city of Rome from outbreaks of the plague. They are associated in Roman popular psychology with what you do in moments of great crisis, is that you go to pray in front of these images. And so obviously the symbolic importance of the Pope having them on hand in St. Peter's Square cannot be overstated. So for most people, though, here in Rome, the most amazing thing about that prayer service Friday night was the fact that Francis was alone. First of all, it was it happened before the transition to daylight savings time in Italy, which meant that it was sort of twilight when he began at 6 p.m. local time, but it was dark by the time he finished. Second, it was a cold and rainy night that night. There was steady rain as the Pope was leading these Vespers and delivering this blessing. And it was, I mean, you have to understand that the Romans, Italians generally, but Romans in particular, we are used to seeing St. Peter's Square full. I mean, popes, any pope really, is a magnet for humanity. Romans evaluate the success of a papacy by how many people they're able on a regular basis to draw to the square. And so to see the Pope standing by himself in that space, where the only sounds were the music being played by the Vatican periodically throughout the liturgy, the sound of the falling rain, and the sound of ambulance sirens as yet another person was being rushed to the hospital because they had succumbed to the coronavirus. I mean, it was I don't use the word mystical very easily, but it was truly remarkable. There's a well-known television critic and historian of TV here in Italy, Aldo Grasso, who has written in Italy's paper of record, Corriere della Sera, that those images of Pope Francis Friday night are destined to pass into history as the iconic image of this crisis, this moment in time. He compared it to other iconic images of popes that people remember. For instance, the fluttering pages of the Gospel as the breeze blew through the book of the Gospels that was sitting on top the casket of St. John Paul II during his funeral. Or that famous helicopter ride that Pope Benedict XVI took from the Vatican to Castel Gandolfo in February of 2013, February 28th, which was the day that his resignation became effective. And it was reminiscent of a movie by Fellini, just the images of Rome that you saw during the course of that helicopter journey. It was unforgettable. But Grasso believes that these images of Pope Francis Friday night actually surpass them all, simply in how shocking it was to the popular psychology, how out of the ordinary, and therefore so deeply moving. The Pope has also tried to demonstrate his solidarity with the people of Italy in particular in other ways. Last weekend, he met with the mayor of Rome, Mayor Virginia Raggi. Now, Rome has not yet been hit particularly hard by the pandemic. Most of the damage has been concentrated in the north of Italy, but Rome certainly does have cases, Rome certainly does have fatalities, and Rome is suffering under the lockdown just like the rest of the country. Then on Tuesday, Pope Francis met with the Italian Prime Minister, Giuseppe Conte, which was a way of him trying to show his solidarity with the entire country. Conte has gotten high marks here for his leadership during this crisis. This was obviously an opportunity for Pope Francis to stand shoulder to shoulder on the very day, by the way, in which the entire nation of Italy and the city-state of the Vatican all flew their flags at half-mast to show sorrow, mourning for all those who have been lost. Again, by the time you see this, probably more than 12,000 people, the highest death toll anywhere in the world. So that's the Pope's response. Let's talk about the broader church. As I mentioned, the Italian bishops have donated millions of euro in relief efforts, but I think the real story probably comes when you dig down beneath that. There are incredible stories of heroism. I will talk about things I know from Italy because that's where I am, but you can find parallels to these kinds of things all over the world. There's a priest in Bergamo who died on March 23rd. He was a prison chaplain in Bergamo. He was known for years for his work among the most ostracized and vulnerable members of the population here, including the prison population. When the coronavirus epidemic broke out, he obtained special permission to continue his ministry in the prison at his own personal risk. In the course of doing so, he contracted the virus, was hospitalized, and eventually died. There is a Capuchin priest up in another region of northern Italy, a 47-year-old, who ran a soup kitchen for hungry people. And of course, the mere fact that a pandemic has broken out does not mean that hungry people magically have access to new sources of food. In fact, it is often more difficult for them to obtain food because grocery stores, although they are allowed to remain open, they are much more difficult to access. I mean, here in Rome, typically we have to wait about an hour before we're able to get into a grocery store, waiting patiently in line, observing all of the social distancing protocols. And of course, we can afford to buy the products that are in there once we actually get in the door. Many homeless people can't. So this Capuchin priest had continued to run this soup kitchen with all the appropriate social distancing restrictions, the hand washing, and all of it. Nevertheless, in the course of his ministry, he too contracted the coronavirus and died. These are two examples among a staggering death count among priests here in Italy. At last count, almost 90 priests up and down the country have died. Many of them were elderly and had underlying health conditions, but others, like the two examples I've given you, are people who have courageously put their lives on the line to serve the most vulnerable members of society amid this pandemic. In smaller ways, there are other Catholic organizations are trying to do what they can. I know of two cloistered orders of contemplative nuns, for instance, that prior to this pandemic, they grew wine or they spun cloth, but they have decided to make by hand the medical masks that Italians are being urged to wear anytime they go out, but which are in tremendously short supply in the country. These two contemplative orders by themselves have made more than 100,000 of them and donated them free of charge to people up and down the country. But perhaps the best example, the kinds of things the church is trying to do, is Cardinal Konrad Krajewski. He is the Pope's almoner. That means he is in charge of the personal charitable initiatives of Pope Francis, known here in Italy as Don Corrado. He is one of the few people right now who is still moving relatively freely all around Rome. He says he's driving about 250 kilometers every day. And this is because he is going around to all of the businesses that are being compelled to toss out food because they're simply, people can't get to it. And he's collecting all of that food and trying to harvest it, in a sense, in order to bring it to the poor, the hungry, the homeless of the streets of Rome. Don Corrado has made himself available in ways that are almost unimaginable, including giving out his personal cell phone number. It has been published by Vatican News, which is the official news agency of the Vatican, which means it is available in theory to hundreds of millions of people, theoretically billions of people all over the world. But he is trusting that it will be used only by those who are genuinely in need. So an elderly homebound person who can't get out and has no access to food, a homeless person who is sick but has no place to self-quarantine, a jobless person who has no way to feed his or her family. These are the kinds of people that he is inviting to call up, and then he will mobilize the resources at his disposal to help. That, I think, is kind of the quiet story of the Catholic response to all this. You know, what people know publicly, of course, is that in a growing number of parts of the world, public celebration of the Mass has been suspended, access to church has been limited, and there's this impression in some quarters that the Catholic Church has kind of come grinding to a halt, you know, that things have shut down. The truth is quite the opposite. While the church is trying to avoid creating conditions under which the virus might be transmitted, which means that its public liturgical life is kind of on hold at the moment, its charitable operations, its humanitarian operations really have gone into overdrive. And in a country like Italy, where so much, for good or ill, depends on the Catholic Church, it is almost difficult to imagine that this country could survive, that it could make it through this crisis without everything that religious orders and dioceses and parish priests and lay Catholic organizations and Catholic associations of all stripes are doing in ways large and small to try to meet the need. All right, finally, we continue to live with a debate in the Catholic Church fueled by this question of exactly how open or exactly how closed should the church be amid the coronavirus? And the tragedy of this debate is that most Catholics probably feel tremendously ambivalent, don't know what to think, because it is a classic case of competing almost absolute values on both sides of the question. On the one side is the imperative that the church must not do anything that would risk creating vectors, new vectors, for the transmission of this disease. The Catholic Church is probably the most powerful, the most visible, the most listened to, the most consequential pro-life movement, organization, group on the face of the planet. And if the Catholic Church were to be perceived today as indifferent to life, as taking steps that needlessly risk transmission of this disease and therefore new infections, new fatalities, new damage to people's health, it is very difficult to understand how at the end of this crisis the church could go back to credibly proclaiming the pro-life case to a culture that often doesn't want to hear it anyway. And if you provide them a new reason to dismiss what the church has to say, it's difficult to project where that might end up. On the other hand, any faithful Catholic would also right now be feeling the pain of a kind of enforced interdict, the inability to celebrate the sacraments. And there is frustration in many quarters that the church has perhaps been a little bit too supine, a little bit too acquiescent in the kinds of restrictions that are being imposed, that it has allowed itself, in effect, to be defined as, well, at the very minimum, inessential, if not borderline irrelevant. That is, the governments all over the world, including here in Italy, are deciding what counts as an essential service amid the coronavirus. In Italy, they include grocery stores, they include pharmacies, they include hardware stores, they even include tobacco shops, butcher shops, all kinds of things. Banks are defined as essential. And so all of those things are allowed to continue operating, but not churches. And in fact, all up and down the country, there have been instances where people have attempted to gather in a church for prayer and have, in effect, been raided. Most recently, over the weekend, there was a situation on Sunday where a group of people in a little town up near Italy, up in the north of Italy, near the border with Austria, 15 parishioners had gathered in their church, its name for the conversion of Paul, not for Mass or the sacraments, but simply to pray together, observing all the prescribed social distancing protocols and so on. Police got wind of it, showed up, issued everyone citations, and now, in theory, they could be subject to the fines that have been laid out by the Italian government for violating the quarantine, which range anywhere from €400 all the way up to €3,000. In theory, they could also be looking at something like 6 months in jail, although no one thinks it's going to come to that. And this is hardly an isolated case. There are people who believe, Catholics who believe, that the bishops ought to be more vigorous in protesting that kind of thing, and in general ought to push for the maximum availability of the sacraments, especially the Sunday Mass, funerals, baptisms, and weddings, on the grounds that if we teach the society that we do not think of ourselves as essential in a moment of crisis, then society will draw the conclusion that we're not essential, period. And increasingly may attempt to hem in, limit, restrict, confine, and so on. The ability to practice the faith, especially in public spaces and at critically important times. Now, the latest development in that debate here in Italy is that the most respected public opinion institute here in Italy, it's called Ipsos, recently conducted a poll which found that 68% of Italians overall, it did not distinguish between Italians who were practicing Catholics and Italians who are not, but 68% of Italians overall support the suspension of public masses. 61% support the suspension of public funerals. This has been an especially painful point for many people up in the north of Italy, where the death count has been the highest, and where you are not allowed anymore to hold a funeral for a loved one who has succumbed to the coronavirus. The most you can do is bring the casket by the front of the church, strictly limiting the group to immediate family, and a priest will come out to say a blessing over the casket before it is interred. But almost 2/3 of Italians support those two measures. What is interesting is on the question of whether churches ought to be closed altogether. Right now, churches are allowed to remain open for private prayer. There are instances where some people believe that possibility has been abused by people gathering in groups in ways they're really not supposed to do amid the crisis. The poll found that 45% would support complete closure of churches, 45% would oppose it, and 10% don't know what to say. And that probably captures, I would think, the spirit of the moment fairly well. Some people believe that this is setting very dangerous precedents, worrying precedents for religious freedom. Other people believe the church will be remembered in a positive key for being willing to bear the same burdens, make the same sacrifices as everyone else, and for doing its part to try to help flatten the curve, to use the term of the day, of this crisis as early as possible. I suspect most thoughtful people, including most thoughtful Catholics, find themselves looking at both of those arguments, thinking they have a great deal of merit, and just really not quite knowing with complete certainty what to think. I will tell you this on a personal note. The one complete certainty I have right now is that I get up every morning and get down on bended knee and thank a merciful God that I am not a Catholic bishop right now charged with making these kinds of decisions, because it is not easy. These are agonizing choices in an unprecedented situation. And I suspect all we can do constructively right now, probably, is take maximum advantage of the opportunities we do have for physical access to pastors and to churches. In the meantime, make do with virtual access. And also pray that those making decisions on our behalf right now, whether they are civil or ecclesiastical authorities, will be inspired by the best wisdom available. That's the best wisdom scientifically and medically, and also in an ecclesiastical key, the best wisdom of the church and its living tradition. All right, those are the big coronavirus stories making the rounds in a Catholic context these days. You can find full coverage of those stories and much more on the Crux site. That is cruxnow.com. Once again, cruxnow.com. For those lonely lockdown hours, I would also recommend checking out all the resources brought to you by the Word on Fire Institute. Their website is wordonfire.institute. One more time, that is Word on Fire, all one word, .institute. Until we see one another again here on The John Allen Show, I invite you to have a fantastic fortnight. Stay healthy. Stay safe. Let's keep praying for one another. And please know that we are praying for you. We are going to be with you throughout this crisis. We are not going anywhere. We will see one another again. Thanks and God bless.